In the previous episode, I introduced the figure of Queen Regent Labotsibeni Mdluli and explored the circumstances of her elevation to power. I highlighted the great stability at the end of her reign and contrasted that with the turbulence and territorial dispossession that preceded her accession. I recounted an anecdote that nicely demonstrates King Banzini's great clemency and magnanimity while also lamenting his record as a statesman. I cast doubt on the mainstream Swazi interpretation of what I think of as the land tenure theory of dispossession. In this episode, I want to try and frame the previous episodes and subsequent episodes by briefly discussing the sources I will be drawing from. This is because, like my repudiation of the land tenure theory indicates, parts of my narrative will depart from the popular account. I will do this by briefly discussing a historian whose work brings to bear a greater conceptual rigor and in that way throws a light on the deeper forces and dynamics that have shaped Swazi history. I will be putting forward a different reading of the key events and processes that have shaped that same history and thereby arrive at a different set of conclusions than the popular account. Let me be clear, my story is firmly within the academic tradition of Swazi history. It is my departure from the popular account that I am concerned with contextualizing. My story can in no way be considered revisionist. It only departs from the popular account in a few respects while accepting the broad outlines of that account. But I think it's important to be upfront about the departure and provide a justification for those departures. In the next episode, I will focus squarely on the narrative, and from that point on, there'll be a minimum amount of meta-analysis. But for now, I want to pause for a moment and take stock of the intellectual foundations of the series. I've arranged my sources from the most relevant to the most peripheral, so that if anyone wants to dive into it, they understand what's important and what isn't so important. The first two sources are absolutely central to understanding Swaziland. If you decide to pick up books and you want to read about and really penetrate into the inner heart of the nation, these two books are indispensable. Swaziland has not attracted the attentions of many historians or writers. It is too small a country, too peripheral a concern, and has the unfortunate distinction of being located in a region dominated by the picturesque and romantic tale that is Zulu history. Writers and historians of great ability and ambition, and these two traits often go together, are invariably seduced by the perennially fascinating figure that is Shaka. And of course, that then leaves very few historical suitors indeed for Swazi history. This iron law of Swazi historiography does not apply, however, to our first two sources. The first of these books is Philip Bona's Kings, Commoners, and Concessionaries. It's really conceptually brilliant and deeply researched, and it's probably the best single treatment of an African country I've ever read. I'm not saying that just because it is the core of my series, but really it's a very impressive book. Bona situates Swaziland in a web of ecological pressures, class relations, implicit and explicit political negotiations. A good example of these political negotiations, an implicit one, is the growth of institutions Swazis have come to take for granted, like the Libandla, or the previously mentioned in the previous episode, Queen Mothership. Bona explains and analyzes its emergence during the early period where Nguni aristocracy conquers a Soto, what would have become an underclass in modern Shiselweni. How do those Sotos end up identifying with this new Nguni aristocracy? Men who come in and revolutionize these social relations, who create the concept of the regiments or amabutfo. Well, They give birth to institutions like the Libandla. The Libandla helps mediate the Soto rise into this new Nguni aristocracy. The queen mothership emerges because a woman like Somjalosa Simelane attempts to curb the worst excesses of her husband and her son. And so Bona explains to us it's a genealogy or an analysis of institutional formation. That's how brilliant his book is. On the concessions era, he's no less brilliant. Instead of looking at the concessions as just the foolish decision of a king, he's quite sympathetic because he's not just a materialist, but he's a social historian as well. He comes to appreciate that during the kingship of Mswati II, for example, the demographic, institutional, and fiscal weakness of the South African Republic allowed the Swazis to have a symmetry of power between them and the Republic. But then there is a transformation in the nature of the Republic. Demographically, it explodes. Fiscally, it becomes incredibly powerful. Institutionally, it is strengthened by the few years of British control in the Republic. So that when you get to the period of Lutfong and Banzeni, the relationship between the kingdom and the Republic is fundamentally transformed. But it's incredibly difficult for the king and the regents to appreciate that. And by the time they appreciate that, it's too late, and it's reconfigured their relationships with the concessionaries in Swaziland. That's just one element of Bona's analysis. The second of our sources is Hilda Cooper's An African Aristocracy Rank Amongst the Swazi. It is an anthropological tour de force. It's through Cooper that we enter the ritual and symbolic world of Swazi kingship and come to appreciate the way their institutions work. Her work is full of careful observation and cultural fluency. And nowhere is that more apparent than in her treatment of something that, frankly, had always puzzled me. In Swaziland, we have a number of royal appellations, acclamatory titles used to exalt the sovereign. We have the usual set, Your Royal Highness, Your Majesty, you get the idea. But as a part of this repertoire, there is a word or phrase that had always attracted my attention, silo or silo school. For me, it always seemed to be invested with a mysterious and really unsettling significance. And nobody had ever explained it to my satisfaction, except to state the obvious, that it referred to the king, or what the Swazis call his situndi, this is his aura. So I was more than a little surprised and moved when I encountered in Cooper's work an explanation of this phrase. The meaning emerges as she is describing the key date of the Ingwal, the ceremony of the first fruit, which is the key ritual of kingship in Swaziland. It is the climactic moment in a series of finely wrought scenes that Cooper unfurls for the reader. To really explain the quote and put it into context, I want to briefly describe the series of events that precede Cooper's quote. All of this is occurring on that key date of the Ingwal. We hear the rhythmic and hypnotic songs of the Ingwal, the weeping and keening of the women as their sovereign moves before them. Then the scene dissolves, and we are in the Inhlambelo, which is the sanctuary, where the children are reluctantly eating of the meat of the Umtujulu, the sacred ox. Then, all at once, in the cattle bear, are gathered the regiments of the nation and the royal family, all wreathed in the finest native dress. At this moment, a preternatural dignity and poise seems to descend upon the scene. As the sun recedes, the sacred song take on a keener edge, and then something extraordinary is seen to take place. The male members of the royal family converge around the king in a circle, and the regiments surge around those princes. The singing grows wilder, more desperate, with the men stomping their feet and driving the king before them towards the Inhlambelo. The woman's weeping grows ever more desperate as the king is forced into the sanctuary. His priests enter the enclosure. Suddenly, a new song, beseeching the king to return, is struck up, and the princes, with their stick, lunge towards the doorway, beat their shields in agitation. Back and forth they surge. And then, as Cooper herself writes, there emerges a figure as weird as the monster of legends. He is Silo, a nameless creature. On his head is a cap of black plumes that covers his face and blow about his shoulders. And underneath the feathers is glimpsed a headband of a lion's skin. His body is covered in bright green grass and evergreen shoots that trail on the ground. In his left hand, he holds a shield smeared with the fat of the sacred herd, the mfugwane. His right hand is empty, and as he moves, it gleams with lines of dark medicine. The fatty tissue, umhlehlo, of the umtutulwa is tied crosswise on his chest, and the blown-up gallbladder lies on the costume. Round his loins is a belt of silver monkey skin. Each item of the costume has meaning and ritual association. The green grass is the umuzi, razor-edged and strong, from which are made the mats in the shrine hut that are kept from one reign to another, a symbol of the life and continuity of the nation. The mfugwane are the sacred animals of kingship that have the tip of their tail cut off to brand them for the work of kingship. They are rarely killed, and those who eat of their meat must cautiously lean forward so that no drop of the fat may touch the body and cause madness. The Swazis say their milk is red and they have human feelings. The king, his mother, and the great ritual wife, Matsebula, smear themselves with the fat. They alone are powerful enough to withstand it and are made more powerful by using it. The silver monkey has the power of life. The Swazi say no one has ever seen it die. It is used as a sling for an heir apparent to the throne. It is, as the Swazis say, his health. In the powerful costume, the king appears reluctant to return to the nation. He executes a crazy and elusive dance with knees flexed and swaying body. The movements are intuitive responses to the rhythm and the situation, a dance that no ordinary man can know and that the king was never taught. The old teachers who trained him in all his duties explained, "We do not know it. We are not kings. It will come to you at the time." Suddenly, he crouches low and disappears into his hole, and the Tinsila, who are his blood brothers, follow close behind, picking up any bits that drop off the sacred costume, lest they be used by enemies to ruin the nation. The princes spring forward, crying, "Come out, King of Kings!" They draw back, pause, sway forward. At last he responds. At his approach, they retire, enticing him to follow. But after a few steps, he turns back, and they close behind him again. Everyone is urged to dance. The Tinvona bring their batons and shout, "Beat your shields!" The people dance with vigor. Here, more than at any other stage, they must keep their king alive and healthy by their own movements. The mime goes on with increasing tension, each appearance of the king making a sudden and startling, unforgettable impact. His eyes shine through the feathers as he tosses his head, his face dark with black medicine. Dripping down his legs and arms are black streaks. He is terrifying. And as the knife-edge grass cuts into his skin, he tosses his body furiously in pain and rage. This description is a small part of Cooper's unrivaled work. She not only explains the significance of this unusual scene, but she lays bare the meaning of Silo, the raw incarnation of kingship. This is how I think of it. So I really think anybody interested in Swaziland must pick up her book. What I also found particularly interesting is the preface of her book. She explains how she became interested in Swaziland as an anthropological topic. She was attending an anthropology conference at the University of the Witwatersrand. And also attending that conference happened to be the Ingwenyama of Swaziland at the time, Sopuza II. She was introduced to Sopuza and struck up a friendship with him. Sopuza happened to be a keen fan of anthropology and had not only read a number of anthropological books and studies, but subscribed to anthropological journals. And so he invited her in Swaziland for her to conduct her research. And so, in that way, she came to know the Swazi, understand them. And what makes her book even more extraordinary is that very often the footnotes are even more interesting than the main body of the text, even though that is interesting itself. Just as an example, there's an instance where she is presenting a particular interpretation of a ritual. And she notes that Sopuza disagrees with that interpretation, but he goes along with that interpretation because the Likoko insists on that interpretation. And I think that small footnote tells us more about Swaziland than all the ravings of most people. The fact that the king, who is supposedly all-powerful, is willing to concede to the Luxotho tells you about the dynamic relationship that exists between the different branches of the executive. So the office of the kingship in relationship to what we, or rather the English would call the Privy Council, the Liqoqo, that the king is bound by tradition, by custom, by the weight of numbers on the council, the prestige of the council members. And so we start to see the sophistication of the system. I found that quite interesting indeed. The next book on my list is Brian Allen Marwick's The Swazi. This is what Cooper's book would have been had it not been so good. It's a small monograph, an anthropological study of Swaziland as well, and anyone who is interested can peruse it. But really, you gain more from reading Cooper's book than from reading Marwick's book. But I wanted to use it as a point of reference in comparison to Cooper. The next book on my list is the first book on Swaziland I actually ever read. It was Hugh Gillis's History on Swaziland. It's very workmanlike. It doesn't have the conceptual rigor of, say, a Bona, nor does it have the depth of sort of cultural fluency that you find in Cooper. But it's also an excellent book, and I will come to rely on it ever more as we get to the later stages of the series, particularly after 1889, because Bona's text terminates in 1889. What I also found interesting was Hugh Gillis's difference with the other person on our list, J.S. Matsebula. J.S. Matsebula resembles a person I'm currently reading about, or at least peripherally. I'm reading a history of the kingdom of, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, Nyiginya, the ancient Rwandan kingdom. And the author in that book notes that the history of Rwanda has been dominated by the historical account of the Abe Alexis Kagame. The Abe Alexis Kagame was a member of the aristocracy, and his history was very Tutsi-centric, monarchical, yet it absolutely dominated the telling of history. Well, J.S. Matsebula is very similar. He's a royalist historian. His account dominates the popular understanding of Swazi history in Swaziland. I say that even though most people haven't read his account, yet his ideas have disseminated and almost by osmosis have come to permeate everyone's soul. There's that lovely quote by Keynes that exemplifies what I mean. Keynes famously writes, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbling of a few years back." This is what I feel Matsebula's influence is like in Swaziland. And the difference Gillis has with him is that he sees Matsebula as seeing Swazi history as being coterminous with the ruling dynasty. Gillis, being a Westerner, profoundly disagrees with this. I personally think Matsebula is right. I think it's ridiculous to take Gillis's point as being valid. And I think as I tell the history of Swaziland, most people will come to agree with me on this. The next source on our list is by a man whose name I find incredibly difficult to pronounce. It is Royly Kloppus, The History and Representation of the History of the Maputo and the Tembe. Most people shouldn't have to read this at all. It's a thesis, I believe, PhD or master's. I read it because it provides the context for the emergence or the slow growth of the Lamini clan in the area of Delagoa Bay and their relationship with the Tembe and the Maputo. And then there are a series of academic articles that are important in situating the emergence of the state of Swaziland during the Mfecane. To understand the emergence of the state that is Swaziland without understanding or appreciating the Mfecane, it's like trying to understand the liberation movements in Africa without understanding the Cold War. It is the context in which all of this is happening. You need to understand how precarious, for example, Sopuzo the First position is. Where is Ndvunye distilling his ideas, for example, say, about the Amabutfo system? So I think it's incredibly important to understand that. You can read the academic papers or you can ignore them. I read them because it was helpful. So Alan Smith had an excellent academic paper. That is the foundation for the theory of Delagoa Bay being the prime mover in the emergence of state formation because of the trade in beads and in ivory and in cloth that happens in Delagoa Bay. His academic paper is The Trade of Delagoa Bay as a Factor in Nguni Politics. You then have Philip Boner's Classes, the Modes of Production, and the State in Pre-Colonial Swaziland. This is important in helping me appreciate Boner's materialist roots. So not particularly important. You have Jeff Guy, his Ecological Factors in the Rise of Shaka and the Zulu Kingdom. And then we have Shula Marx, The Tradition of the Natal Nguni, a second look at the work of A.T. Bryant, and then John Wright, Political Transformation in the Tukela Mzimkulu region. Are you sleepy yet? Finally, I'm almost done. We have Julian Corbing, The Mfecane as an Alibi, and Elizabeth Eldridge, The Sources of Conflict in Southern Africa circa 1800 to 1830, The Mfecane Reconsidered. The last two are absolutely brilliant. I think they're brilliant because they show the tension in sort of the academic field of Nguni state formation. Julian Corbing's academic paper was written as a response to or in reaction to the ideological underpinnings of the Afrikaner Republic. The Republic had justified its emergence by citing the historical event that is the Mfecane. They justified themselves as having moved into empty space, that space having been emptied by a series of wars started by Shaka, cascading out and then forcing people to leave the region, and then the Afrikaners moved in. Julian Corbing was writing to dispute that fact. He puts forward a different idea of the Mfecane, the idea that it was started by the slave trade in Delagoa Bay and then continued or put on steroids by the Griquas. Elizabeth Eldridge's academic paper is an analysis, or let's be honest, an evisceration of Corbing's arguments. I've never read an academic paper more brilliant. She is incredibly careful in her analysis of Corbing. She goes back and looks at the logs that he's citing. She shows moments where he shows bias. She shows moments where he is citing numbers that absolutely do not exist at all. And while she is sympathetic to what he is trying to do, she, quite frankly, embarrasses him. And I found it to be an education in academic integrity in writing. And then finally, the last books, these are books I am currently reading, and they're shedding more light on the events. The Great Trek by Norman Etherington, The Zulu Warriors, The Battle for the South African Frontier by John Leband, And finally, also by John Laband, The Historical Dictionary of the Zulu Wars. So that's it. Those are the sources I will be using for the series. I'm putting the sources out there so people understand what I am drawing from, the context I will be providing. If anyone has a different point of view, if you want to point me to a different source, I would be more than happy to engage with it. But I'm also putting these sources forward because I don't want people who are going to tell me a different point of view and their source is their uncle. No uncles, please. Give me a proper academic source. I'll be more than happy to engage with it. So, in the next episode, we will be jumping into the narrative and you won't have to hear about sources any longer. Please like, subscribe, share this video. Thank you.